I can't fix this out here. We need a tow. A tow could take hours. We don't have hours.
He's right. Is there another way?
The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen table since 7 in the morning, and by the time Vivian Ashford finally reached for it at 9:30, her coffee had gone cold twice. She knew what was inside. She had known since the night before, when her mother had set it down in front of her with the particular brand of quiet that Margaret Ashford reserved for moments she considered final. Not angry quiet. Not disappointed quiet. The kind of quiet that had already made up its mind and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Vivi tore the envelope open the way she did everything she dreaded. Fast, before she could talk herself out of it. The document inside was 4 pages, single-spaced, printed on paper thick enough to feel like a verdict. At the top, in clean serif font, marriage agreement between parties. Vivian Claire Ashford and Daniel James Hale. Below that, a date. Below that, an address in Caldwell, Indiana, that Vivi had to read 3 times before she accepted it, was real. Indiana. She set the papers down, picked up her cold coffee, drank it anyway. The story, as her mother had explained it the night before with the measured tone of someone presenting a quarterly report, was this. 3 weeks ago, Vivian had gone over her mother's head and reported their family's primary business partner, Gerald Fitch, to the Massachusetts Securities Division for what she had identified as fraudulent valuation in a joint real estate development deal. She had done this because it was the right thing to do. She had done this because she had the documentation, the instinct, and the title of Director of Strategic Communications at Ashford Group, which she had believed gave her the authority to act. What she had not known was that her mother had been aware of the irregularities for over a year, had negotiated a quiet arrangement with Gerald Fitch, and had been receiving a percentage of the falsified returns deposited into a private account that did not appear on any Ashford Group balance sheet. Vivian had not merely reported a business partner. She had, without knowing it, reported her own mother. The Securities Division had opened a formal inquiry. Gerald Fitch had retained criminal defense counsel. And Margaret Ashford, rather than face any of this directly, had decided that the most elegant solution was to remove Vivian from Boston entirely. The marriage had been arranged in 8 days. Vivi still did not fully understand how. She knew only that Daniel Hale was the son of a man who had done business with her late father 20 years ago, that he owned a working farm outside of Caldwell, Indiana, and that he had agreed to the arrangement without, as far as anyone could tell, asking a single question. The car arrived at 10 to take her to the notary's office in downtown Boston, and Vivi got in because what she had learned in 27 years of being Margaret Ashford's daughter was that there were battles worth fighting, and battles that would simply consume you, and she needed to choose. She told herself she was choosing strategy. She was not ready to admit she was choosing survival. The notary's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Federal Street, with a view of the harbor and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. Vivi arrived first. She sat in one of the 4 chairs arranged around a rectangular table and placed her handbag on the chair beside her, the way she always did in meetings she did not want to be in, taking up space as a form of protest. Daniel Hale came in at 11 o'clock exactly. She had formed an image in her mind based on the available information. Farmer, rural Indiana, no higher education listed in the brief profile her mother's attorney had provided, age 34. She had expected someone weathered in the obvious ways, someone with the slightly apologetic posture that she had observed in people who had spent their lives being made to feel that where they came from was something to be excused. The man who walked through the door did not have an apologetic posture. He was tall, which she had not anticipated, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym membership, and he moved through the room with a quietness that was not the same thing as smallness. He wore a dark gray shirt, clean dark jeans, boots that had seen real use. His hair was dark, slightly long at the collar. He had eyes that were a particular shade of brown, the color of river water before a storm, and when they found her face across the table, they did not look away in the manner she had expected. They simply looked, steady and unhurried, the way someone looks at a landscape they have been watching for a long time. Then he looked out the window. He did not introduce himself. He sat down across from her, folded his hands on the table, and directed his attention to the harbor view, as though the rest of the room had ceased to be of interest. The notary arrived. The attorneys arrived. Documents were arranged and explained and initialed and signed. Through all of it, Daniel Hale remained quiet in a way that had texture and weight to it, the way a room full of old furniture is quiet. Not empty, just very still. Vivi signed her name 7 times. She watched him sign his name 4 times, and his handwriting was a surprise. Precise, unhurried. The letters formed with the particular care of someone who did not write casually. When it was done, the notary said something warm and professional about wishing them well, and the attorneys shook hands with each other in the way attorneys did, and Vivi stood and looked at the man who was now, on paper, her husband. He was already looking at the window again. She wanted to say something sharp, something that would establish clearly and immediately that she was not a woman who had been adequately contained by this arrangement. But the words that came to her felt too large for the fluorescent-lit room, too tangled with things she wasn't ready to say in front of attorneys, and so instead she picked up her handbag and walked out first, because that was the only small victory available to her. The drive to Indiana took most of the day. Vivi rode in a car her mother's office had arranged, and Daniel drove separately in a truck that was older than anything she would have expected, but rode with an ease that suggested it was better maintained than it looked. She watched it in the side mirror for a while, and then stopped watching. She slept somewhere in Ohio. She did not dream. The town of Caldwell was smaller than she had calculated it would be, even after she had looked it up. Main Street had a diner, a hardware store, a post office, a church with a reader board that said, "All are welcome, even the tired ones," and a gas station with only one pump. The landscape beyond the town was flat in the way the Midwest is flat, which is to say not empty but open, the sky larger than it has any right to be, the horizon a clean, unbroken line in every direction. The farm sat 4 miles east of town on a county road. It was larger than she had expected. The fields were planted with something she couldn't name at this distance, rows of green running in neat parallel lines toward the tree line. There was a barn, painted red in the traditional manner, and a workshop building, and 2 smaller outbuildings she could not yet identify, and the house. The house was a surprise. She had built a picture of something modest to the point of bleakness. A farmhouse from a different century, with water stains and a porch that tilted. What she found instead was a house that was clearly old. White clapboard siding, a wide covered porch, windows with real wood frames, but maintained with an attention that went beyond mere upkeep. The porch boards were level. The paint was fresh. There were window boxes she had not expected, empty this time of year, but clearly planted in season. The front door was a particular shade of dark green that someone had chosen deliberately. Inside was quieter than outside, which she hadn't thought possible. The main room ran front to back, a living area at one end and a kitchen at the other, separated by a large wooden table that looked handmade. The floors were original wide plank wood, worn smooth but not damaged. There were bookshelves built into the wall on either side of the fireplace, and they were full, not decorative full but read full, the books arranged with a certain logic she couldn't immediately decipher, some of the spines worn soft at the edges. There was a reading chair by the window, with a lamp positioned exactly right. Vivi stood in the middle of the room and revised several of her assumptions at once. Daniel set her single suitcase by the stairs without being asked. He showed her the room she would have, which was on the second floor at the back of the house, with a window that looked out over the east field. The room was clean to the point of precision. Bed made with the corners tucked, a small wooden dresser, a hook on the back of the door, a blue quilt folded at the foot of the bed that looked old and well-loved and had clearly been washed recently. Someone had put a glass of water on the nightstand. He paused at the door. She waited for him to say something about the arrangement, about expectations, about how things were going to work. What people say in the first hours of an impossible situation. He said, "Bathrooms at the end of the hall. Hot water takes about 40 seconds. Then he went back downstairs. Vivi sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house. It made the sounds old houses make, settling and breathing, and beyond that, the sounds of a working farm in late afternoon. And beyond that, nothing but wind and the enormous silence of Indiana. She was not going to cry. She made this decision clearly and set it aside. She unpacked her suitcase with more care than the situation warranted, because arranging things was something she could control. She hung her clothes in the small closet. She placed her toiletries on the dresser with the labels facing out. She plugged her phone into the wall and checked her messages and found 3 from friends in Boston asking how she was, 1 from her assistant, who didn't yet know she no longer had a job to return to, and nothing from her mother. She went downstairs an hour later because she was hungry, and because staying in the room felt like a form of retreat she wasn't willing to accept on day 1. Daniel was at the kitchen counter, his back to her, and the room smelled of something that made her stop 2 steps from the bottom of the stairs. Garlic, and something herbed, and the particular warm smell of bread that was already baked. On the table, the large wooden one, there were 2 place settings. There was bread in a cloth-covered basket. There was a pitcher of water. He had cooked. She had not expected him to cook. She had expected, she did not know what she had expected, something transactional and cold, something that matched the silence of the notary's office. She sat down without saying anything because she didn't know how to acknowledge this without it meaning more than she was ready for it to mean. The food, when it came, was simple and very good. She ate more than she intended to. He ate across from her and looked out the window at the darkening field and did not attempt conversation. And she could not decide if this was considerate or maddening. She decided eventually that it was both. After dinner, she offered to help with the dishes because her manners were deeply ingrained, and he said, "I've got it," without any inflection that suggested she should push the issue, so she didn't. She stood by the kitchen window while he washed up and noticed, for the first time, the bookshelves from this angle. She could read the spines now. There were farming texts, yes, soil science, water management, sustainable agriculture, but there were also books on corporate law, on economic policy, on the history of land ownership in the American Midwest, on game theory. A copy of Poor Charlie's Almanac that was marked throughout with small penciled notes. She looked at the cover of that one for a moment, and then she saw the envelope. It was on the far end of the kitchen table, partially beneath a folded dish towel, but she could see the edge of it clearly enough. Thick, cream-colored paper, the kind used by law firms of a certain tier, and in the upper left corner, a logo she recognized because she had grown up in a world where such logos mattered. The letterhead of Kessler Pratt, which was one of the 6 largest corporate law firms in the country, and had offices in New York, Chicago, and London, and did not, as far as Vivian Ashford was aware, have any reason to be sending mail to a farm in Caldwell, Indiana. She looked at it for exactly as long as she thought she could without being obvious. When she glanced up, Daniel was looking at the envelope. He picked it up without hurrying, without changing expression, and opened the drawer beneath the kitchen counter, the one with the small brass lock that she hadn't noticed before, and placed the envelope inside. He closed the drawer. He did not look at her. "Good night," he said. He turned off the light above the sink. Vivi stood in the kitchen for a moment after he had gone, in the dark and the quiet, the smell of dinner still warm in the air, the drawer with its small brass lock 3 feet away. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark under the blue quilt and looked at the ceiling and thought about the letterhead of Kessler Pratt and the books on corporate law and the handwriting that had been too precise and the truck with the old body and the expensive tires she had noticed in the driveway when the headlights caught them at the right angle. She thought about the fact that no one had told her anything about who this man actually was. She thought about the fact that she hadn't asked. She fell asleep before she finished deciding what to do with any of it, and outside the window, the Indiana sky was full of stars, the way Boston skies never were, thick and indifferent and very far away. 3 weeks into living on the farm, Vivi had developed what she privately called her system. She woke at 6, which was later than Daniel but earlier than she had ever voluntarily woken in her Boston life, because the house got bright fast and the sounds of the farm started before that, and she had discovered that lying in bed, listening to things happen around her, was worse than getting up and having opinions about them. She made coffee in the kitchen, which was already clean by the time she came downstairs, because he had been up since before 5. She drank it at the table by the window. She watched the fields. This part she had not expected to find bearable. She found it almost necessary. At 7, Daniel came back from the early morning work, knocked his boots against the porch step, and came in for his own coffee. And they occupied the same kitchen in a silence that had, over 3 weeks, become something neither hostile nor comfortable, but simply theirs, the way a room takes on the temperature of the people in it. He did not ask her questions. She had steeled herself for this, for the intrusive curiosity she associated with small-town life, the asking after where she was from, and why she was here, and what did she think of Indiana. And it had not come. He did not ask about her life in Boston, about her work, about her family. He did not ask what she thought of the farm. He did not ask if she was all right. She had found this, in the first week, infuriating. She had found it, in the second week, something closer to relief. He showed her things without explaining them. He showed her where the garden was, still coming in for the season, and left a basket by the back door without comment. And she understood that this meant she was welcome to it. He left a book on the kitchen table one morning, a field guide to the plants of the Central Plains, and she did not know if it was meant for her, but she read it for 2 hours and replaced it where she had found it. The next day, it was gone. She did not know what to make of him, and so she watched him the way she had learned to watch people in business settings, without appearing to. He worked the way people work when they are not performing labor, but actually engaged in it, without the self-consciousness of effort, without the pauses that mean someone wants to be noticed. In the mornings, he was in the fields. In the afternoons, he was in the workshop or in the outbuilding she had learned was for equipment maintenance, or talking with the two farm hands, Marcus and old Pete, who came 3 times a week and addressed Daniel in the shorthand of people who have worked alongside someone for years. He read in the evenings, almost every evening in the chair by the window, with the lamp at exactly the right angle, and the books were different each time. One night it was a novel she recognized, a recent one that had been well reviewed in places she trusted. Another night it was something on infrastructure and water rights. Once, when she came downstairs late because she couldn't sleep, she found him with a yellow legal pad on his knee covered in dense handwriting. The book open beside him face down, and he looked up at her without surprise, as though he had heard her on the stairs, and said nothing, and she said nothing, and she poured herself a glass of water and went back up. She was not softening. She was very clear with herself about this. She was simply updating her information. The morning the truck broke down was a Tuesday in late September, when the sky had turned the particular blue that means autumn in the Midwest has stopped pretending and committed. Daniel had taken the old truck into town for a supply run and had asked, with the same absence of expectation that characterized all his requests, if she wanted to come. She had said yes, because she was developing a feeling about the locked drawer in the kitchen that she needed to dilute by doing something ordinary. And a drive into town was ordinary enough. They were 4 miles from the farm, on this county road with the gravel shoulder and the soybean fields on both sides, when the truck shuddered once with real conviction and stopped. Daniel pulled to the shoulder. He got out without visible frustration, which she noticed, lifted the hood, looked at what was there for about 45 seconds, and said, "Fuel line." He said it the way you say a thing that has happened before and will happen again, and is not worth larger emotion. He called a garage. She stood on the gravel shoulder with the big sky above her and the smell of turned earth all around, and her good shoes making small divots in the soft ground at the road's edge. And she thought about how there was no version of her life 3 months ago in which she would have been standing on a county road in Indiana, next to a man she had married in a notary's office, waiting for a truck to be towed. The truck from the garage arrived in 20 minutes. It was driven by a man in his 50s with a sun-weathered face and a gray cap, and the ease of someone who had lived in the same place long enough to stop explaining himself. He got out, and when he saw Daniel standing by the truck, he did something that made Vivi go still inside. He took off his cap. It was a small gesture, the kind that happens fast enough that you might miss it, but Vivi had spent years in rooms where the architecture of respect was expressed in exactly these small ways, and she did not miss it. The man put his cap back on almost immediately and said, "Morning, Mr. Hale. Let's have a look." And he did not speak to Daniel the way anyone spoke to a neighboring farmer whose truck had died on a county road. He spoke the way someone speaks to a man they are trying not to inconvenience. Daniel thanked him by name. He did not acknowledge the cap. On the drive back to the farm in the garage's courtesy truck, with a borrowed car from a neighbor arranged for the week, Vivi sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window and said carefully, "Is there a reason the mechanic addressed you so formally?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. The silence that she was learning had different textures. "Tom's a careful man," he said. "He's like that with most people." "He's not like that with most people," she said. "I've met most people." He glanced at her once, a sidelong look she was beginning to learn the weight of, and then he looked back at the road. He did not say anything else. She did not push it. Not yet. She was gathering. The call from Cade came that evening. Her brother was 3 years older and had always moved through the world with the unearned confidence of someone who had inherited enough of everything to mistake it for merit. He called her on her cell while she was sitting on the back porch, watching the light change over the east field, and his voice, when she answered, had the particular warmth he deployed when he wanted something. "How's farm life?" he said. "You adapting?" "You always were good at adapting, Viv." "What do you want, Cade?" He laughed, which he did when she cut through the performance, and he was deciding whether to drop it. He usually dropped it with her faster than with anyone else, because she had known him too long. "Mom's moving on the trust," he said, and his voice lost the warmth like a coat coming off. "You know she's been talking to Ellison for months about restructuring the voting shares. Now that you're out of the picture, the timing works." Ellison was the family attorney. The restructuring he was describing meant that without Vivi's physical presence at the next board-level family council meeting, the voting shares that her father had specifically designated to her would be absorbed into the general trust and distributed according to Margaret's directive, which meant Cade. "She can't do that in 30 days, Vivi said. The charter requires a 30-day notice period," Cade said, "which started the day you signed the marriage contract and left Boston. You have about 9 days. I'll come back. Will you?" And his voice had something in it she didn't like. "Because I'm not sure you understand what Mom's been telling people. The story is that you had a breakdown. That the thing with Fitch was a breakdown. Coming back 9 days in and demanding a seat at the table is going to look exactly like what she'll say it looks like." "You're helping her with this," Vivi said. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either, which was its own kind of answer. "I'm calling you because you're my sister," he said. "Take that for what it's worth." "I know exactly what it's worth," she said. She hung up. She sat on the porch in the cooling air and felt the specific anger that comes from watching a thing you suspected was happening become a thing that is confirmed. The anger had a shape to it, familiar, the shape of having been managed by her family since she was old enough to have opinions they found inconvenient. She was going to have to go back to Boston. She was going to have to fight this in rooms where everyone had already been told a version of her she didn't recognize. She heard the screen door open and close behind her. Daniel came out and sat on the porch step, which was below her, and looked out at the field the way she had been looking. He was holding a glass of water. He did not ask what the call had been about. After a while, she said, "I need to go back to Boston." He was quiet. The field was going gold at the edges, where the last light hit it. "If you leave now," he said, not looking at her, his voice level and without drama, "you lose more than you think." She looked at the side of his face. "What does that mean?" He turned and looked at her, and for a moment the evening light was full on his face, and she could see something in his expression that wasn't the careful blankness he usually carried. Something that was either concern or warning, or something else she didn't have the context yet to name. "It means," he said, "that going back in 9 days angry is not the same as going back at the right time with the right position. The right time is in 9 days, or I lose the vote." "There are other things to lose," he said. "What things?" He looked back at the field. He drank his water. The silence came back, but it was different this time, thicker, pressed with something she couldn't get to. "Give it a few more days," he said. "There are things you don't know yet." It was the most he had said to her at one time. She stared at him for a long moment, at the profile that gave away nothing, at the large and deliberate stillness of him. "That's not a good enough answer," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." The apology startled her more than anything he had said before it. She had not expected him to apologize. She turned it over in her mind as the last light left the field, and the sky went the dark blue of true autumn night. And she could not find the angle from which it was anything other than genuine. She did not go back to Boston. She told herself it was strategy. She was not yet ready to examine whether it was trust. The Harvest Gala was held in the Caldwell Cooperative Barn, a building that had once stored grain for the whole county, and now, one Saturday each October, stored 200 people in flannel and good shoes, eating food cooked by people who had grown it themselves. Vivi had not planned to go. The invitation, such as it was, had been a handwritten note left on the kitchen table by Marcus, who had been asked by someone to tell someone, which was how things got communicated in Caldwell outside of the volunteer fire department radio system. Daniel had mentioned it once, in the morning coffee silence, without any particular inflection, and Vivi had said she would think about it, and then had said yes later in the day without quite meaning to. She owned nothing appropriate for a barn. She owned a great many things appropriate for the kind of events she had attended in Boston and New York, but the Harvest Gala was not those events, and she stood in front of her open closet on Saturday afternoon and made the executive decision to wear dark jeans, a cream-colored cashmere sweater that was the most casual thing she owned, and her second-best boots, which were at least made of leather robust enough for uneven ground. Daniel was waiting on the porch when she came down. He looked at her boots and said nothing. She chose to take this as approval. The barn was warm and loud with the particular warmth and loudness of people who have been in the same community long enough to be genuinely glad to see each other, not performatively, the way party guests are glad. There were string lights along the rafters and long tables with food and a band in the corner that was playing country music. She didn't know the words to, but that had a rhythm that moved in her chest the way music does when you stop trying to analyze it. She met a lot of people. This was unavoidable and, she found, not as grueling as she had anticipated. The people of Caldwell asked her the questions she had been braced for. Where was she from? Did she like the farm? Had she met so-and-so? But they asked them with a directness that she found unexpectedly easier to handle than the coded curiosity of Boston's social circuit. Here, people wanted to know what they asked. In Boston, people asked one thing and meant another. She was standing near the edge of the room talking with a woman named June, who ran the local veterinary practice and had opinions on soil composition that she deployed with impressive force, when she saw Daniel on the other side of the barn. He was talking to a group of older men, farmers mostly, with the wide hands and the particular stance of people whose bodies have been shaped by outdoor work over decades. He was not talking the way she was used to seeing him talk, which was to say sparingly, with long pauses. He was leaning against one of the barn's vertical beams with his arms crossed, and he was saying something that made the men laugh. A real laugh, the kind that moves through a group like weather. She had not heard him laugh. She had not seen him make anyone laugh. She stood with her cider and watched this version of him that she did not have a category for. The version that knew these people by the names of their children and the conditions of their fields and the particular nature of their worries. He was not performing ease. He had it. She turned back to June, who had moved on to cover crops, and tried to focus. 40 minutes later, she went looking for the bathroom, which was at the back of the barn through a doorway that ran alongside the organizational office, and she heard, through the door left ajar, a phone conversation in progress. The woman on the phone was speaking with the compressed urgency of someone managing a sensitive conversation in an inconvenient location. C'est you. I'm telling you, the total came in at $94,000, which is exactly what we needed for the full vendor list plus the school matching grant. I sent the confirmation to the committee chair this morning. She wants to know if she should acknowledge the donor publicly or... A pause. Right? Right. Anonymous is fine. We'll just put it in the program as a community benefactor. But I do want to say for the record that whoever reached out through the Kessler office, Vivi stopped moving. I mean, it saved the whole event. We were 40,000 short as of 3 weeks ago. The kids' programming, the agriculture scholarships, all of it was going to get cut. So if you do speak to Mr. Hale, please tell him the committee is incredibly... Vivi turned and walked back into the main room. She stood in the middle of the party for a moment, cider in hand, the band playing something she still didn't know the words to, the warmth of 200 people around her, and she looked across the room to where Daniel was now standing alone, looking out one of the high windows at the dark outside. She crossed the room. He heard her coming, or sensed her. She was beginning to think he registered things at a range most people didn't, and he turned before she reached him. "You funded this event," she said. It came out quieter than she had intended, which was almost certainly better. He looked at her for a moment with that steady river water gaze, and then he looked back at the window. "The community needed it," he said. "Through the Kessler office," she said. A beat. "They handle some of my charitable giving." The word charitable giving arranged itself in her mind next to the locked drawer and the mechanic's cap, and the copy of Poor Charlie's Almanac, and the books on corporate law, and the structure that had been building, piece by careful piece, acquired another beam. "Who are you?" she said. She did not mean it as an accusation. It came out with something rawer than that. He turned to look at her fully, and this time he didn't redirect his gaze to the window, and the something she had seen on the porch that evening, the thing between warning and concern, and a third thing she hadn't named, was present in his face again, closer to the surface. "Does it matter," he said, "where the money came from?" "That's not what I asked." "I know," he said. She waited. Across the room, the band started something slower, and a few couples moved to the center of the barn floor, and the string lights overhead made everyone's face softer than it probably was. "I'm a farmer," he said. "That's not nothing." "I didn't say it was." "You thought it." She opened her mouth and then closed it, because he was not wrong, and she was not willing to lie about that. "I thought it," she admitted. "I thought it, and it was wrong of me, and I've been revising it for 3 weeks. Something shifted in his face. It was small, the way things that mean a great deal are sometimes very small. He looked back at the window. "There are things I need to tell you," he said, "but not here, and not yet. Can you wait a little longer?" "I've been waiting for 3 weeks," she said. "I don't know what I'm waiting for." "I know," he said. And again the apology was there, genuine, and without decoration. "I'm asking you to wait anyway." She stood beside him for a moment, looking at the same dark window, the party continuing around them with the warm noise of people who belong to each other. She thought about everything she still did not know, and everything she was beginning to suspect, and the fact that suspecting was not the same as knowing, and that she had spent enough of her life acting on incomplete information to at least recognize the shape of it. "Fine," she said. "But I want it understood that I'm choosing to wait, not being kept." He looked at her. "Understood," he said. She went back to June and the cover crops, and she did not look at him again for the rest of the evening, and she did not acknowledge the fact that she had looked at the door when he left, and had noted that he left alone, and had noticed the way Marcus and old Pete and Tom the mechanic and 4 other men whose names she was learning, all found a moment to speak to him in the last hour of the party, brief and direct. The way people speak to someone they want to make sure they see before the night is over. She filed all of this away. That night, on the porch of the farmhouse under the ridiculous abundance of stars, the temperature finally cold enough to need a jacket, her phone buzzed with an email from Cade. She opened it, expecting words. It was a photograph, a document. Their mother's letterhead, dated 4 days ago, addressed to Ellison, the family attorney. It outlined a modification to the voting share structure of the Ashford Family Trust. It referenced a medical consultation that had determined Vivian Ashford was currently in a condition of emotional instability that warranted a temporary removal of her board participation rights. At the bottom, in her mother's handwriting, a note. Handle this before the council meeting. She won't fight it if she doesn't know until it's done. Below the photograph, Cade had written, "Thought you should see this." I didn't agree to the medical piece. He had agreed to all the rest of it. She knew him well enough to understand that this message was not loyalty. It was insurance. He was creating a record of a line he had not crossed, so that later, when the accounting happened, he could point to it. She sat on the porch for a long time with her phone and the cold and the stars. She had trusted that there was something to learn, some reason to wait. She had extended the kind of measured patience that did not come naturally to her and had not felt natural for a single day of the 3 weeks she had been here. And now there were 5 days until the council meeting, and her mother was using a fabricated medical opinion to remove her from the table. And she was sitting on a porch in Indiana next to a man who knew more than he had told her and had asked her to trust him. And she did not know if that trust was earned or simply the product of 3 weeks of isolation, making her confused about what she was willing to accept. She heard the screen door and then the quiet sound of his boots on the porch boards. He sat on the porch step, as he had before, and looked at the field. She turned her phone screen toward him without a word and let him read. He read it once, then again. His expression did not change dramatically. There was a tightening at the jaw, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, the kind that comes from containing rather than resting. "You've known something like this was coming," she said. It was not a question. He handed the phone back to her. "Yes," he said. "How long have you known?" "Before the wedding," he said. She breathed in slowly through her nose. The cold air tasted like earth, and something distant, like the first edge of approaching winter. "Tell me," she said. "All of it. Right now." And this time, he didn't ask her to wait. He told her on the porch, with the stars doing their indifferent work above them, and the field dark and silent in front of them, and the cold settling in around them both like something that had decided to stay. He told her that his name was Daniel James Hale, and that he was the founder and operating CEO of Hale Agricultural Holdings, which was a private company, deliberately private, with operations across 11 states in agriculture, land development, and rural infrastructure investment. He told her that his father, Robert Hale, had been a farmer in exactly the sense that most people meant when they said farmer. A man who had worked this land and others like it his whole life, who had known her father in the way that 2 people know each other when one has money and one has land, and they both understand what land is worth. He told her that when his father died 7 years ago, he had left Daniel the farm and a modest amount in savings, and Daniel had turned the savings into a position in a small agricultural commodities firm, and the position into a stake, and the stake into ownership, and ownership into a company that now had revenues her mother's Ashford Group could not match in a good decade. He told her that 3 months ago, his board, the people he had chosen and built and trusted, had moved to dilute his controlling stake through a financial mechanism that he had not seen coming, orchestrated by his CFO, a man he had worked with for 9 years. He told her that he had removed himself from the day-to-day operation while his attorneys worked to reverse the mechanism, because he needed to be somewhere that was not boardrooms and glass towers, while he decided if he still wanted the thing he had spent 15 years building. He told her that he had come back to the farm. She listened to all of this without interrupting, which took a level of discipline she was aware of in real time. My attorneys were reviewing the Ashford Group filing as background, he said, because your father and my father had an investment arrangement that was never fully dissolved. The estate is still, technically, a minority stakeholder in one of my original land funds. When your mother began structuring the marriage arrangement, it triggered a disclosure notice to our legal team. And you agreed to it, she said. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Not the deflecting quiet or the careful quiet. The kind of quiet that means someone is about to say the true thing. Because I wanted to know, he said, if a woman who had grown up the way you grew up could live in a place like this and see it for what it was. And because my attorneys told me what your family was doing to you, and I thought that was wrong, and I thought... He stopped. He started again. I thought that if you were the kind of person the Fitch report suggested you were, you deserved better than what was being done to you. She looked at him in the dim light from the kitchen window, at his profile, and the set of his jaw, and the way he was looking at the field rather than at her. You observed me, she said, like an experiment, like a person I was trying to understand. You could have told me. If I had told you, you would have behaved differently. That was the point. Wait. She stood up from the porch chair. She walked to the railing and held it with both hands and looked out at the dark field, and felt the anger move through her in a slow, comprehensive wave. The kind of anger that is also grief. The kind that comes from recognizing that you have been managed again, by someone you were beginning to trust, in a way that felt, even now, different from all the times before. You had no right to make that choice for me, she said. No, he said. I didn't. She turned. He was looking at her now, directly, without the deflection of the window. I'm not going to defend it, he said. I'm going to tell you that I'm sorry, and that what I saw over these 3 weeks made me sorry in ways I didn't fully anticipate. You're not what I was testing for. You're more than what I was testing for, and I understand that doesn't fix it. She looked at him for a long time. The anger was still there. She was not someone who let anger resolve itself cleanly in one conversation. But underneath it was something else, something that had been growing for 3 weeks in the space made by his silences. And she was honest enough with herself to know it was there even when she didn't want it to be. What do I do about the council meeting? She said. That's not an evasion, he said. It's a choice, she said. I'm choosing to deal with the thing I can deal with first. You and I are going to have a longer version of this conversation, but right now I have 5 days. He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite relief and not quite admiration, but sat between them in a way that changed the air. Your father's original charter, he said, has a provision that's easy to miss because it was added as a rider in 2004, and your family's attorneys have apparently not considered it relevant. If a named beneficiary is present at and participates in a family council session within 30 days of a qualifying life event, and a marriage is a qualifying life event under the original charter language, their voting rights cannot be suspended or transferred during that council session or for 60 days following it. Your mother cannot invoke the medical override if you're in the room. How do you know this? My attorneys have spent 3 months reading every document connected to both families, he said. It's what I pay them for. She thought about this. It had the specific shape of a solution that was going to cost her something. If I go to that council meeting, she said slowly, and I stand up and participate, I'm confirming that I entered this marriage voluntarily. That destroys any argument I might make later that I was coerced. Yes. And the only reason I have not been making that argument already is that I've been trying to decide if it's true. He was very still. Is it true, he said, that you were coerced? She thought about the notary's office and the fluorescent lights and the cold coffee and the 4-page document. She thought about the fact that she had signed her name 7 times, and not once had she asked the attorney beside her to stop. Not once had she stood up and walked out. Not once had she done any of the things she would have done if she had been entirely unwilling. She had been choosing. She had not known what she was choosing, but she had been choosing. No, she said finally. It's not entirely true. Something in his face changed then, something significant enough that she looked away because the moment felt too large for the porch. Then, go to the meeting, he said. Participate. Invoke the charter provision. Your mother's medical override fails the moment you're in the room and speaking with coherence. The email Cade sent you is evidence of the conspiracy to remove you. Use it. I'll lose the argument about being forced out. You'll lose that argument, he said, and you'll keep your seat. You get to choose which one matters more. She leaned against the railing and looked at the sky. There were too many stars for a person to think clearly underneath, she'd decided. The scale was wrong, but the cold was useful. The cold helped. The evidence about my mother and Fitch, she said. Can your attorneys put together a package? It's already prepared, he said. I had it prepared 2 weeks ago in case you needed it. She closed her eyes for a moment. 2 weeks ago. He had been holding it for 2 weeks, not because he was withholding, but because he was waiting for her to ask. She understood, from a tactical standpoint, that this was correct. She understood, from every other standpoint, that it was deeply complicated. I need to tell you something, she said, not opening her eyes. Okay, he said. When I signed those papers in Boston, I was furious, and I was frightened, and I thought this was the worst thing that had happened to me in years. And then I got here, and every day I woke up and revised that opinion by some amount I wasn't keeping track of. And now I'm standing on this porch 5 days from a fight that could end my family's control over a significant amount of my future, talking strategy with a man who turns out to be someone I don't know at all. And the strangest part is that I'm less afraid than I've been in months. She opened her eyes. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, which she had learned over 3 weeks was considerable. I don't know what to do with that, she said. I'm going to go to Boston and do what needs to be done. And then we are going to have the conversation about who you are and who I apparently am and what all of this means. But I need to say it before I leave because I learned young that unsaid things have a way of being buried by whatever comes next. He stood up from the step. He was tall. She always had to readjust to his height when he stood. He was close enough that she could see the particular quality of his eyes in the dim light, the river water brown with something underneath it that was warmer than the surface. I'll have the package sent to your phone by morning, he said. "Every document, time-stamped, authenticated. You'll have what you need." "Thank you, Vivi." It was the first time he had used her name. Not Vivian, which her mother used like a formal letter. Vivi, which only people who knew her used. She waited. "I'm not going to ask you to come back," he said. "Whatever happens in Boston, whatever you decide, I won't hold the arrangement over you. But I want you to know that what I said about not defending the choice I made, that I kept things from you, I meant it. And if you come back, I won't keep things from you again." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who was Daniel Hale the farmer and Daniel Hale the CEO, and, she was beginning to understand, someone else entirely underneath both of those. Someone she had been living alongside for a month without seeing clearly, because she had arrived already certain she knew what she was looking at. "I'll come back," she said. She said it the way she signed documents, fast, before she could negotiate herself out of it. Then she went inside to pack, and he stood on the porch alone for a while, and the field was very dark, and the stars were very many, and neither of them said anything else that night. She left at 6 in the morning. He was already in the field. She did not look for him. She got in the borrowed car and drove toward the highway, and did not let herself watch the farm in the rearview mirror for longer than the length of the driveway, because she had a 5-hour drive and a room to book in Boston and a fight to prepare for, and she had learned to allocate her attention to what was in front of her. The evidence package arrived on her phone at 6:14. She pulled into a gas station on the highway to read it. It was thorough. It was damning. It was the kind of documentation that a certain kind of attorney would look at and immediately begin discussing settlements. She thought about Daniel Hale, somewhere behind her in the early morning of an Indiana field, and the fact that he had said, "Whatever you decide," which was the first time in her life she could remember someone with sufficient power to shape her outcome choosing not to. She pulled back onto the highway and drove toward Boston, and the thing she had been avoiding for a month, and she felt underneath the anxiety and the strategy and the anger that was still present and legitimate, something that was shaped like the very first steps of a long walk you have finally decided to take. The Ashford Group's headquarters occupied the top 4 floors of a building on Boylston Street in Back Bay, which Vivian had always thought was more about the address than the space, a decision her father would not have made, and her mother had made the month after he died. She arrived at 9:15 on a Wednesday morning, 22 days after the wedding, wearing a charcoal blazer and her best shoes, and the particular expression that she had spent years cultivating for rooms that were going to be difficult. The security desk called up to confirm her access. The woman at the desk knew since Vivi had left, hesitated before confirming, which told her something about how much had already shifted. The elevator opened onto the boardroom floor, and Vivi walked toward the conference room at the end of the hall where the family council was already assembled, and she could see through the glass wall that her mother was there, and Cade, and Ellison the attorney, and 3 independent board members who had been appointed by her father, and who now sat with the careful neutrality of people waiting to see which way a thing would fall. She did not knock. She opened the door and walked in. Margaret Ashford looked up from the head of the table, and her face did the thing it always did when something had not gone according to plan. It did not change. Her mother's face was an instrument of extraordinary discipline. She was 61 and looked 50, and she sat the way she had always sat, with her back perfectly straight, and her hands folded, and her expression arranged to suggest that she had considered all possible variables and was comfortable with all of them. The variable she was now looking at directly was the one she had sent to Indiana. "Vivian," she said, This meeting is for board-designated members. I'm aware, Vivi said. She put her bag on the table and sat down in the empty chair across from Cade, who was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read and didn't particularly want to. She pulled out her phone and set it on the table. She looked at Ellison. I'm invoking Section 4B of the 2004 Charter Rider, which guarantees my participation rights at any family council convened within 30 days of a qualifying life event as designated in the original trust documents. My marriage 22 days ago qualifies. I believe you're familiar with the provision. Ellison, who was 67 and had been the family attorney since before Vivi was born, looked at his papers and then looked at Margaret. Is that accurate, Ellison? Vivian said. He cleared his throat. It is a provision of the original charter, yes. Good, she said. Let's get started. Margaret unfolded her hands. Vivian, we should discuss privately before we... I'd prefer to discuss everything here, Vivi said. In front of the board members my father chose specifically so that there would be independent witnesses to council decisions. See, the three independent board members, who had been watching with the careful neutrality of people at a tennis match, shifted almost imperceptibly. There's been a concern raised, Margaret said, about your capacity to participate in the medical concern, Vivi said. Yes. You mean the documentation you directed Ellison to prepare, based on a consultation you did not tell me about, from a physician I have never met, which was intended to be finalized before I arrived today, so that I couldn't contest it. She picked up her phone and turned it so the email Cade had forwarded was visible. She did not hand it across the table. She let them see that she had it. I have that in writing, with your signature on the instructions. The room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet when everyone in them has stopped performing calm and is simply in it. Margaret looked at the phone. Then she looked at Cade. Cade looked at the table. That document, Margaret said, was a precautionary measure designed to protect... It was designed to remove me, Vivi said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this not in front of a mirror because she had learned that practicing in front of a mirror taught you to perform rather than to mean it, but in the car on the highway with the Indiana fields going past, saying the words until they were just words, and the anger underneath them was fuel rather than disruption. And it would have worked if I hadn't known to look for the provision in the charter, which I found out about from someone who had read every document more carefully than anyone in this room apparently has. Vivian. Let me finish. She looked at the three board members. These were people who had known her father, who had sat across from Robert Ashford in this same room and been appointed by him because he had trusted them to do the thing the family couldn't always do for itself. See clearly. My mother has been receiving a portion of Gerald Fitch's falsified returns for 14 months. My report to the Securities Division was accurate. The investigation into Fitch is ongoing, and I have reason to believe the SEC inquiry is being expanded. She placed a second document on the table, slid from a folder, a summary her own attorney had prepared in Boston the night before, based on the package from Daniel's team. This contains the bank records, the transfer confirmations, and the internal correspondence between Fitch and my mother over the course of the arrangement. My attorneys have copies. The SEC has been notified that this documentation exists and will be subpoenaed in the course of the investigation. The room temperature had changed. Margaret had gone very still, the kind of still that is not composure but its absence. Cade looked up from the table. He looked at Vivi, and she could see on his face something she had not expected. Not guilt exactly, but recognition. The face of a man who had made calculations that were now revealing their actual costs. "You can't prove that's not fabricated," Margaret said, and her voice had lost something. The certainty. A corporate law firm in Chicago with a 40-year reputation authenticated every document, Vivi said. "You're welcome to retain your own authentication, but the timeline works against you." "What do you want?" Margaret said. It came out smaller than anything her mother had ever said in her presence. Vivi looked at her. At the woman who had organized her removal from her own family, with the same calm efficiency she applied to charitable board membership and dinner party seating arrangements, who had, in some version of her own logic, believed that this was simply how things were managed. Problems were relocated. Inconveniences were restructured. People who couldn't be controlled were reclassified. "I want what was specified in Father's original trust," Vivian said. "My voting shares, my board participation, and a conversation with the SEC that doesn't include you trying to manage it from the outside. Whatever comes from the Fitch investigation, you handle it honestly. That's all." "That's not all," her mother said. "No," Vivi said. "It's also the end of the medical override filing, and an acknowledgement from Ellison on the record that Section 4B was validly invoked today." Ellison said, without looking at Margaret. Section 4B was validly invoked. Margaret looked at her son. Cade looked at the window. "Call the vote," one of the 3 board members said. He was a man named Harold Finch, who had been appointed in 1998 and had never, in Vivi's memory, raised his voice. "On the reinstatement of Vivian Ashford's full participation rights as specified in the original trust, per Section 4B, effective immediately." The vote was 5 participants. Vivi voted for herself. The 3 independent board members voted. Cade sat with his hands flat on the table and did not vote, which was abstention, which under the charter rules counted neither for nor against. The count came out 2-2. Harold Finch had voted for her. 1 other board member had voted for her. The 3rd, a woman named Patricia Coles, who had been appointed to the board by her mother in 2019 in what Vivi now understood was not an accident, had voted against. 2-2. The room waited. "The charter requires a tiebreaker provision," Ellison said, in the voice of a man who has been the family attorney for 30 years, and would like very much for this to be someone else's problem. "In the absence of a casting vote from a quorum member, the matter is deferred to the next council session," which meant postponed, which meant that her mother retained interim control during the deferral, which meant that the thing Vivi had driven 5 hours to accomplish was, at this moment, unfinished. She sat with this for a breath. 2 breaths. The boardroom door opened. It opened the way doors open when someone on the other side has a reason to be there and knows it. Without apology, without theater, just the clean fact of entering. Daniel walked in. He was wearing a dark jacket over a gray shirt, which was the most formally she had seen him dressed, and he moved through the boardroom the way he moved through most spaces, which was to say, without announcing himself, and with complete certainty about where he was going. He stopped at the foot of the table, and the room adjusted to his presence, the way rooms do when someone enters who has taken up space before. "My name is Daniel Hale," he said, directly to Ellison. Hale Agricultural Holdings is a minority stakeholder in the Ashford Land Development Fund 3, established 2019, per the investment arrangement between Robert Ashford and Robert Hale Sr., continued in my name upon my father's death. Under the fund agreement, Hale Holdings has a non-voting observer seat on any family council that addresses the fund's capital structure. He placed a document on the table. Ellison picked it up. Under the observer seat provision, Daniel continued, a quorum challenge may be filed by the observer if the council's composition is found to have been altered in a manner inconsistent with the fund's governance protections. The medical override filing, which I have also reviewed, constitutes such an alteration. I am filing a quorum challenge on those grounds. Under the challenge provision, the current vote is void, and the council must be reconvened with a full quorum of independently verified members, at which point the Section 4B invocation is reheard. He sat down in the observer chair at the foot of the table. Ellison read the document. He read it twice. His expression did not change, but his jaw moved the way a person's jaw moves when they are working through something they did not anticipate and are doing it in real time. The provision is accurate, he said. He said it to the room. He did not look at Margaret. Patricia Coles, who had voted against Vivi and who had been appointed to the board by Margaret, said, "On what basis?" "The basis is the fund agreement that has been in effect since 2019, Daniel said, which your board accepted when the fund capital was used in the Ashford Group's acquisition of the Medford properties. You can verify the documentation through your own counsel." Patricia Coles looked at Margaret. Margaret Ashford, who had arranged and managed and directed every room she had walked into for 30 years, looked at her hands. It took 2 hours. The reconvened vote, with the quorum properly established and Patricia Coles recused pending a conflict of interest review, came in 3-1 in Vivienne's favor. Her participation rights were reinstated as of that afternoon. The medical override filing was withdrawn. Ellison, with the particular relief of a man who has been wanting to be on the right side of something for a long time, drafted the confirmation immediately. Margaret left the boardroom before the final signatures. She did not say anything to Vivian on her way out. She paused at the door for a moment, and Vivi looked at her mother's back and the set of her shoulders, which had the quality of something that had been holding itself very straight for a very long time, and felt the complicated tangle of things you feel about the person who made you, even when what they have done is not something you can easily forgive. She would deal with that later. There was a great deal she would deal with later. Cade lingered. When the room had emptied, when it was just the two of them, and the table full of documents, and the view of Back Bay going gray in the October afternoon, he sat across from her and looked at his hands. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "Yes," she said. "I didn't think she'd go as far as the medical filing." "You should have known she would. You've known her as long as I have." He looked up. "Are you going to—" "No," she said. "I'm not going to include you in anything I take to the SEC. That's not because I think you're innocent. It's because you sent me that email, and I'm choosing to weigh that against everything else you did. But Cade—" She waited until he was looking at her directly. "This is the last time I protect you from a choice you made. Do you understand me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes." She picked up her bag. She left the documents on the table for Ellison to file. She found Daniel in the hallway outside the boardroom, standing by the window at the end of the corridor with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the same Back Bay afternoon she had just been looking at from inside. She walked toward him, and he turned when she was still 10 feet away. "Thank you," she said. "The quorum challenge was a legitimate legal tool," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you anyway." Jory, they stood for a moment in the hallway, with the sounds of the building around them, the distant movement of an office at midday, the hum of the city outside the windows. He looked at her with the same steady attention that she had spent a month learning to read. "How did you know to come?" she said. "My attorneys monitored the council filing," he said. When the vote was called, they called me. I drove up this morning. You drove from Indiana? Yes. She thought about him on the highway at dawn, in that old truck with the expensive tires, driving toward a room he didn't have to enter. You said you weren't going to hold the arrangement over me, she said. And you weren't going to ask me to come back. I'm not, he said. I came here for you, not to keep you. She looked at him, at this man who had been a farmer and a CEO and a stranger and, somewhere in the 3 weeks between, had become something she didn't have a clean word for. She thought about the silence of the farm in the early morning, and the coffee, and the book left on the kitchen table without comment, and the porch and the stars and the way he had said her name once, just once, like it was something he had been thinking about for a while. You know what's strange, she said. Probably many things, he said. I missed the field, she said. I drove here on the highway in the dark this morning, and I passed through about 100 miles of flat, and I thought, I miss the specific version of flat that I know. That's strange. Something moved in his face, the thing she had first seen on the porch and had been watching ever since, the thing that lived underneath the stillness. That's not strange, he said. It's not very Boston of me. No, he agreed. She took a breath. I said I'd come back. That was before the council meeting, before knowing how this would go, before any of this morning. I want to make sure you know I'm not saying it because of obligation, or because the arrangement is still technically in effect, or because… Vivi, he said. She stopped. I know why you're saying it, he said. You said it on the porch because you meant it, and you wanted it on the record before things got complicated. That's who you are. She looked at him for a long moment. When we go back, she said, I want to know everything about Hale Holdings and the CFO situation, and why you chose the farm, and what your father was like, and what's in those books you mark up with pencil. All of it. No more locked drawers. No more locked drawers, he said. And I want, she said more slowly, to actually start. Whatever this is. Not as an arrangement. Not as a test. As something we choose to be in. He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had touched her with any intention behind it. And his hand was the hand of someone who worked with them. And it was warm. And he held hers with the same quality of attention he applied to everything, which was to say, completely. I'd like that, he said. They stood in the hallway, with the afternoon going gray behind the windows, and the city doing what the city does. And she felt, in the complicated warm center of her chest, the beginning of something that was not a resolution or a conclusion, but a direction. The sensation of a thing becoming, rather than a thing fixed. They took the highway back to Indiana that evening, him in his truck and her following in the borrowed car, and the stars came out somewhere in Ohio the way they always did. Too many of them, more than were strictly necessary. She didn't sleep this time. She watched the road and thought about what was in front of her, which for the first time in months did not feel like a series of threats to be managed, but like a place she was actually going. There are things that arrive in your life labeled as punishment that turn out to be something else entirely, though you cannot know this until you have lived inside them long enough to see past the first impression. The conditions that look the most like loss, the stripped title, the silenced voice, the room you didn't choose in a place you couldn't have imagined, sometimes carry, folded within them, the precise shape of what you actually needed, which is never the same as what you thought you wanted. The people we dismiss before we know them, the silences we mistake for emptiness, the flat and open land we drive past on the highway without looking, these have a way of waiting. They do not ask to be seen. They simply remain, patient in the way that real things are patient, until we run out of reasons not to look. And when we finally do, what we find is not a consolation for what we lost. It is the discovery that we have been looking all along in the wrong direction.